Hi everyone, it's Lindsay with High Altitude Astrology bringing you another video. And today I'm going to be talking about the transit of Mercury turning retrograde. And this is going to happen on June 17th. And it will occur at 14 degrees of Cancer. And it will retrograde all the way back to 5 degrees of Cancer, which will happen here on July 12th when it turns direct. So the dreaded Mercury retrograde is what you stereotypically think of when you hear about Mercury retrograding. And yes, there is something to that. It tends to be a time when we need to pay more attention to things involving communication, scheduling, short distance traveling, that kind of thing, because those are all mercurial energies. And so you may find that it's a time when you realize, you need a new computer, or you need a new phone, or your printer stops working properly, those kinds of things. Or maybe your scheduled date for an appointment was wrong. So really, it's just saying that we need to give ourselves a lot of space to handle some of these technical challenges, these communication challenges, these scheduling challenges that may come up during this length of time, so that we don't allow it to get us super frustrated and, like emotionally flustered. And that can happen very easily because Mercury is retrograding in the sign of Cancer. And Cancer has to do with our emotions and our feelings. And then, of course, Mercury is about communicating. Now, when the retrograde occurs, what happens is the functioning of Mercury tends to turn more inward, and we have to understand how Mercury is operating through the archetype of Cancer in our life more deeply. And so what that could bring for us is perhaps an ability to get more deeply in touch with how we are feeling, and also the ability to communicate and share from that place of being in touch with how we feel within ourselves. Because of Mercury being in the sign of Cancer, another expression of this Mercury retrograde energy could also be that we tend to respond from a very emotional place without allowing ourselves the opportunity to logically think about things, because that's what Mercury wants to do. It wants to gather facts and gather data and information and make a decision. Whereas Cancer might be coming from a totally different energy of, but this is how I feel. And so that can sometimes lead to expressing from a very feeling oriented place without giving ourselves enough time to think. So perhaps if we do find ourselves getting emotionally tangled during this Mercury retrograde time, we can remember and take a deep breath and know that we're allowing those emotions to overwhelm us at those times, and that it would be better to perhaps take a step back, take a few deep breaths, and approach whatever it is from a more rational place. I wanted to read about from Stephen Arroyo's Chart Interpretation Handbook, and he says that communication for Mercury in Cancer is done from an emotionally, instinctively, and sensitively place. It's protective of one's own thoughts. Mercury in Cancer learns through absorption, relying on feelings to make connections between bits of information. Mercury in Cancer nurtures new ideas until they blossom as creative skill. Mercury in Cancer has a good memory because Cancer is ruled by the moon, which deals with the past. So it says good memory and retentive qualities contribute to learning abilities. And Mercury in Cancer brings subconscious prejudices and fears, which can interfere with objectivity and attention to new ideas. So that's just in general what somebody who has Mercury in Cancer in their natal chart may relate to. But that gives you a description of the various ways that Mercury in Cancer can express itself. But again, because it's going to this retrograde time, it's really going to be shining a light on the various ways that Mercury in Cancer may operate within us. And in a positive way, what I can see is this being, if we can sort of find our way through the emotionally turbulent energy, we may be able to access a place where we are able to really express what we're truly feeling. And I think that could be the really positive expression of the Mercury in retrograde time, especially because there's some various aspects that I want to show you that are going to happen with Mercury while it's going through its retrograde process. But first, I do want to mention, we've had some other interesting transits happening just in the last week. On June 11th, we had the Sun square Neptune. And you can see that here in this chart. The Sun was at 20 Gemini and Neptune was at 20 Pisces. And here you can see Mars at 19 Pisces, that is almost at the same degree as Neptune. And actually 2 days later, which was the 13th of June, they did make a conjunction, Mars and Neptune in Pisces, still within a 3-degree orb of squaring the Sun. Now the Sun being in the sign of Gemini means that Mercury in Cancer is influencing that Sun in Gemini. And so what I've observed from these latest transits that I just pointed out is that the Sun is our identity, our solar light, how we shine our individuality out into the world. You could even say it's our divine connection to Source operating through us. It also can be symbolic of leadership, because it does rule the sign of Leo, which relates to leadership. But also what has happened with the Mars conjunct Neptune in Pisces is that there's something about the self-assertive energy, Mars, and Neptune, which is this idealization of in some ways perfection. It's it's spiritual transcendence, it's compassion and empathy, universal love. But because these two energies have been in a square position to one another, from what I can see, I feel like there's been some needing to sort of wade our way through some of the information, going back to Mercury ruling the Sun in Gemini. So it's like how we shine our light through our communication and the information that we're sharing that is being challenged by this Mars-Neptune conjunction in Pisces, where we really may want to be rooting for the underdog. You know, this is the spiritual warrior where, love conquers all. But it can also be codependency, and it can be misplaced purpose or misplaced empathy. It's almost like martyrdom. That's what you get with this Mars, Neptune, and Pisces. So I feel that this combination, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because Mercury now is going to start retrograding, which is the ruler of Gemini. And I think we may see a continuation of some of this just kind of confusion and needing to clarify the expression of the solar nature, of the purpose, of the identity that might be being a little bit consumed by the nebulousness of Neptune conjunct Mars, without fully comprehending Gemini, all the facts. And so Mercury is going to come back through its retrograde in Cancer, and I think it might kind of inflame some of this even more. and maybe I need to bring up an example, like there's just been so much in the news lately, and I feel like so much of it speaks to our emotions and our sensitivity and our desire for us to really transcend all boundaries, which is wonderful and great. But I think sometimes that can be at the expense of our rational and logical minds. And I think it can cause us to jump to conclusions. And I just feel that it's easy to, for example, read a headline and then decide that you think the same thing without fully investigating all of the details of any situation. I think it can be easy with Mars squared Neptune and Pisces to just sort of slap a sticker over something and say, this is what needs to be done now, and it's like, okay, but let's think logically, Sun in Gemini, about all the facts and all the logistics and how this is going to actually occur. Let's say, for example, like defund the police, which has been something that's been brought up. I mean, you hear that slogan, and some people, I think, truly do believe they want to completely have that mean defund the police. But I do think it's nuanced, and there are other people who perhaps believe that too, but they have another perspective of it, of how to move funds from certain aspects of a budget and put it more towards social services that can, help people so that we don't need as much militarization from the police in our communities. So that's another level. But then an even another level of it is, and I heard this on my own local news today, in one of the cities where I live, it's like, well, the budget for the police is already underfunded. So, taking away funding from the actual police isn't necessarily how it can be done, but perhaps taking money from other parts of the budget can, be put into this idea. But then there are other people coming from another side, other counselors, city councilors saying, we need a more formulated plan, and we need to look at exactly how much structure, what it is that we're trying to do is going to need, and how much funding that's going to need. So there's just so many layers right now that have to be looked at. And I feel like this Mercury in Cancer retrograding is going to continue to kind of bring this emotional piece into our thought process. And I think we have to be really aware of not getting carried away by our tides of emotion when maybe more mercurial thinking logic is required. And on the other hand, Mercury in Cancer, expressing ourselves intuitively and expressing ourselves, here were some other keywords, emotionally, instinctively, and sensitively, is important. And it also, again, says protective of one's own thoughts. And I think that this might be another manifestation of the Mercury in Cancer energy. I know I've been experiencing a little bit. It's like purposely choosing kind of not to get involved in certain debates on social media, for example, where it's just it's creating a lot of conflict. There's not really a lot of resolution, and it's questioning, like, what is the usefulness of this? And again, it's, as it's saying, Mercury in Cancer can be protective of one's thoughts. Maybe this Mercury retrograde time can be a good time to reflect and sort of understand more, like, okay, do I really need to, like, be doing this with my thoughts and words? Or, is it okay enough for me to just know how I feel and know where I stand, and not necessarily choose to have to let the world know all the time. All right, so let's look at some of the other aspects that Mercury in Cancer retrograde will be making. And again, it goes retrograde at 14 degrees of Cancer on June 17th. And the first aspect it's going to make after that is a sextile to Uranus. Now, this already occurred one time before, And that's when Mercury was early on in its direct motion. It also sextiled Uranus previously. So this is the second time that Uranus and Mercury are going to be meeting. And I would say one clear example of this energy is that, we've seen with the Uranus and Taurus, which I've talked about before, is this transformation, really kind of shocking change of values. That's what Taurus is all about. It's material possessions, but it's also our personal values, what we find valuable. And Uranus is kind of just creating a lot of upheaval and a lot of disturbance because Uranus wants to evolve humanity. So with this Mercury in Cancer retrograde sextiling Uranus, we may be finding that we're understanding a little bit more about our own change of values at this time, and we're getting a more solid understanding within our personal self of what those changes might be, but how we're integrating them into our emotional self, and perhaps being able to ultimately share, communicate about that with people in our lives. Again, I would just say with the caveat of Mercury retrograde in Cancer that we just make sure we kind of keep a lid on the overly emotional expression of our communication. It's good to express ourselves, but to be really attached, to needing others to think or feel the way that we do in order for us to feel secure isn't necessarily the best expression of Mercury in Cancer, because you're going to find yourself always sort of frustrated and flustered at trying to continuously, prove your point to other people. Then the next energy that's going to come up along Mercury's retrograde travel is a square to Chiron in Aries. And Chiron is the wounded healer, and Aries is all about self-assertion. Aries is ruled by Mars, the god of war. And Chiron is the wound, but it's also the wounding process and the healing process that we can go through in specifically regards to self-assertion and self-worth and the feeling of the right to exist. So obviously you can see that playing itself out in some of the world affairs that we're all experiencing. And with Mercury retrograde squaring that Chiron in Aries, I mean, this is going to be very impassioned communication, and it's going to be having the experience of realizing that you want to begin to stand up. That's what Chiron in Aries is about. And so with this Mercury in Cancer, maybe we're seeing where we haven't necessarily been able to express ourselves from a deep feeling place in our lives. And so that energy is coming into contact with the wound around self-assertion. So the highest expression of this would be for us to be able to realize that maybe some of this feeling of being unable to stand in our truth and express who we are comes from some sort of wound that we can recognize and ultimately work through, and ultimately then be able to communicate from our emotional place, but without necessarily this need for some of the baser Chiron in Aries ways. And let me read a little bit about that. This is from Martin Lass, Chiron, Healing Body and Soul. And he talks about how the Chiron in Aries energy can express itself in a wounded way. And what that would look like is tendencies towards putting others first, seeking to please others, sacrificing the self, sabotaging the self, giving away power to others, failing to stand up for the self, being afraid to take a stand. But as a reaction, it could also be futile, grandstanding, bravado, aggressive reaction to what we perceive as others' put downs, misplaced stoicism, championing the causes of others in order to feel valuable and worthy, and or a stubborn resistance to asking others for help despite our desperate plight. And finally, tendencies towards living vicariously through others, compulsively needing to help others, trying to rescue others who also lack self-worth, retreating from conflict, confrontation, and challenge, and or avoiding circumstances and situations where taking a stand or expressing an opinion is required. So that kind of runs the gamut. But what I feel from this combination is that if we're really comfortable with how we feel and being able to communicate when we need to about how we feel, then we can feel empowered. We can feel that we are standing in our truth and that we don't necessarily need to act out some of those Chiron in Aries energies that I just described, where, you know, we're not feeling our lack of worth, and therefore we're coming more from, let's say, with a Mercury in Cancer retrograde time, an overly emotional place where we're super duper trying to convince others through almost like an emotional plea to agree with us. All right, then what's going to happen is that we are going to get a square between Mercury and Mars as Mercury continues its retrograde. This can just be some really intense communication. I mean, Mars, again, the god of war. In Aries, its home sign by this time. And this, you know, these two energies, Mercury in Cancer, Mars in Aries, this could just be a lot of, you know, sometimes what happens with Mercury in Cancer is we want to hold our feelings in because we don't feel comfortable letting them out. So this could be a lot of passive aggressive kind of energy where we're not getting it out. And so it's motivating us, and it's motivating our thoughts and our words and our communication in this very passive aggressive way that comes up at this time. And it would most likely be better to recognize that we're doing that, especially with the retrograde, as it's asking us to see how Mercury in Cancer is operating in our own lives, and helping ourselves by taking a stance, or, you know, speaking our truth, saying what we need to say, or at the very least, if it feels too vulnerable to be able to do that on that day, you know, just realizing there's going to be a lot of emotion bubbling up, and maybe things that might need to be addressed could be handled on another day. All right, and after that, then we get Mercury going direct, and that happens on July 12th. And it's at 5 degrees of Cancer and 30 minutes. So the last thing I want to mention is that there is going to be a solar eclipse. As you can see right here, the sun and the moon conjunct at 0 degrees of Cancer on June 21st. And this is going to be just a few days after Mercury has moved retrograde. So this is going to amplify the Cancerian archetype. And eclipses, solar eclipses, relate to new beginnings, and often they come with a clearing out of the old. And so in this instance, with the sun and the moon, our divine light and our emotions expressed in this very Cancerian, nurturing sign, what might be being cleared out is just some of our old history, because again, the moon relates to the past, Cancer relates to the past, in the way that we emotionally express ourselves. And this is the beginning of that clearing out. And so it'll be interesting to experience this eclipse while Mercury is also retrograde in this sign, because it's emphasizing that there's a lot of focus on the Cancerian archetype, which mothering, nurturing, emotion, feminine, but in how we express it, you know, and how we share that with ourselves and with the community around us is going to be highlighted. And again, this eclipse is going to be clearing the slate, clearing the way for new ways of expressing ourselves collectively on an emotional level. Thanks so much for watching. If you like my channel, please subscribe, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.